So, season of new life, here we are. I wanted to set a little bit of a theological context. So how many of you remember St. Francis of Assisi? I think he was in the 1400s, 15th century. And you know, he was a pretty bad actor as a young adult or a young child. He was pretty spoiled. He squandered wealth. He ran around to having wars with different city-states in Italy, and just was, you know, eat, drink, and be merry. Okay. Somewhere along the line, he had a bit of a conversion experience and came to realize that he wasn't being fulfilled and that he wanted to devote his life to the poor. And I think he even spent a day or a week or some time pretending he was poor, trading places with a poor person, like the prince and the pauper, so to speak. You know, a lot of what we know about him is legend, so, you know, who knows what's true. But I think one legend or one true tale, I'm not sure which, is how he was coming home from Rome one day and he stopped on the outskirts of Assisi at a small church called St. Damian's to pray. And he prayed before a crucifix inside the church. This picture is of him later receiving the stigmata, but I liked it because it has buildings in it. So this isn't quite what the story is I'm telling you. He was praying before the crucifix, and Jesus' voice came to him and said, "Francis, go and rebuild my church, for it is falling into ruin." So Francis said, "Okay, I'll do it." And he started getting bricks and mortar and trying to get his father to sponsor the rebuilding of St. Damian's. And he ran into all sorts of trouble again. His father thought this was a stupid idea, and you know, long and short of it was that it came to Francis eventually that rebuilding the church was not about the bricks and mortar. Rebuilding the church is not about the buildings. It's about the people. So a couple of things I wanted us to take away from this tale today is, number one, as the bishop said this morning, this problem of crumbling buildings needing repair, deferred maintenance, is not new. We are not worshiping in the churches that were built by the apostles or even after Constantine made Christianity a living religion, the state religion. We're not worshiping in those buildings for the most part anymore. The buildings come and the buildings go. So that's one thing. And the other is that as we're talking today about buildings, I want us to remember that we're really talking about building the people of God and using buildings to bring in God's kingdom. The means to the end, not the end in and of themselves. I think we all understand that at some level, but we get so wrapped up in the building part, sometimes we forget, even in our efforts to overcome that. We have a history of incredibly beautiful buildings. You know, Coventry Cathedral. This is 1901. I love this. Can you imagine if you were on the building committee of this church? How much time you'd be spending? You can just feel the water seeping through the grout, right? The stained glass windows letting in all that cold air. Beautiful, beautiful cathedral. What happened to Coventry Cathedral? That's right. How many times have you sat at a vestry meeting and wished for an insurance fire?
Pray for it.
Yeah. Be careful what you pray for. So did the people of Coventry, England, after the war, rebuild Coventry Cathedral to its former glory? No, they didn't. They took what was the rubble of the church and they made it into a center for reconciliation. And part of you, probably you know that what you can't see here, there's a cross made of the melted down nails from the wooden parts of the structure. And over here, I think over on this side, if I remember correctly, they built a new cathedral. Now, one of our groups said it's ugly, it's boxy. Well, yeah, it's not a Gothic cathedral, but it has this beautiful, several stories high glass window with etchings in it that you look through from the cathedral into the old cathedral, into this beautiful, beautiful ruin that now has become a place for people to come and pray, a center for learning about reconciliation. So we didn't rebuild Coventry Cathedral. In fact, if you wander around Europe, you see ruins all over the place. Ruins of churches, ruins of castles, ruins of convents. This is a nunnery out on Iona. And we're just not used to that in the United States. You know, we have right now some abandoned strip malls. We have some abandoned inner cities, like Detroit comes to mind, where shops and civic buildings are not in use anymore. We have, in the Boston area, some abandoned Roman Catholic churches that have not been sold yet, but we don't drive around the countryside surrounded by the historic remnants of the time before quite so much. In the Pennsylvania, where I grew up, in farm country, you drive now and you see things that look like this that were once barns, beautiful fieldstone barns where the roof and the wooden part has fallen in, and they look like this. But we don't see much churches looking like this the way you do around Europe, right? So we're just not used to it. But the fact is that over time, as the bishop said this morning, these ruined places have become to be meaningful centers of other spiritual kinds of life or commerce. Now, if we fast forward a little bit and come to the United States and think about the insurance fire that happens. This is St. Paul's Church in Brookline. I'm sorry it's a bad picture. I picked it off the internet and I just can't get the resolution good, but I think you get the point. Fire destroyed the interior of this beautiful country Gothic church in Brookline. So they faced that decision, do we rebuild or not? And their decision was yes. They rebuilt. The exterior looks very much like it did before the fire, but they put solar panels on the roof, which is a travesty to some people. But this became a witness, an evangelistic tool that they didn't know was going to happen. This is the church that does solar energy. This is the church that cares about the environment. This is a church I want to go to. St. Mary's Church in Dorchester, one of our traditionally black parishes, big church, small congregation. We sold a church in that deanery. The people of the deanery wanted the money to go to St. Mary's Church, so we put close to $500,000 into a new roof and some other structural things. And it also became a witness to the community. Here we are in this downtrodden neighborhood, and the church is putting money into their building. Something must be happening here. Well, you might say, where do we get this money? We'll talk about that later. But the idea is, how does your building become a witness and a way to attract people as opposed to kind of a downtrodden money pit? They went different on the interior. They made it open, light, and movable chairs and furniture. So they have concert series, they have beautiful worship of all different styles. In some pictures, or in some times when I've been there, they've had bands up there so they can do different styles of worship. And obviously they have a pretty good organ. So they've made it a very flexible space, which again, at the time they were doing this, was very daring, very, very daring. So the last kind of down memory lane or forward-looking thing I want to talk to you about is, what if you have a building? This is our cathedral. Does it look like what you think of as a cathedral? It certainly doesn't look like Coventry Cathedral. It looks like a bank. You get off the subway at Park Street, which is kind of the center of downtown, right on the Boston Common. You come out the stairs and you look at this wall of offices, and tucked in the middle is this building. And it, even with the banners, it does not shout out, we're a church, come here. So on the other hand, it's in a strategic place, and we're not going to tear it down, and we're not going to start over. It's, on the historic register, so anyway. So how do we think about how to use this building and make it more welcoming? Again, how to get the money will come later, but this is just what we're thinking in terms of redesigning the front so it's a little more welcoming, a little more open. You'll note up on the top, they never finished the pediment up there on the top. So the architect that is helping them with this, kind of puts something that looks like what you might see on the Parthenon, some people, and I don't know, what else would be up there. One of the things that has come to the cathedral at this point is that is not going to be a very exciting thing, that when people get off the subway, they're going to say, oh, look, there are a bunch of saints and Jesus on the top of that church. So they did a contest to see what they had artists submit ideas to fill the pediment. And they have chosen something that looks like this, that will be lit at night, the chambered nautilus. I mean, the theological things that you can do with this are pretty amazing, although we're getting some pushback that it's too pagan, but it'll attract attention. Inside, box pews. Beautiful old New England box pews with the little gates and everything. Well, actually, the gates have been taken off, some of them. New idea, movable seats, circular. How do you decide what is strategic and what isn't? You know, we're not going to change cathedrals. That was a decision. That's for a part of our strategy. It's in the downtown, well, for lots of reasons. How does a diocese or a deanery decide what buildings are crucial and what congregations are crucial to keep? So I have two ideas, and I'll share a third idea that someone gave us at the end of the last time. So I'm going to move a little bit quickly. In our diocese in 2003, with the newish bishop, we developed a 10-year mission strategy, right? And those of you who are from the Diocese of Massachusetts are already rolling your eyes because we're so tired of hearing about mission strategy. But in 2003, they set out at Diocesan Convention 14 things that we'd like to work on. And can you imagine a mission strategy with that many things? Couldn't focus. It's the Diocese of Massachusetts, too many good ideas. 2006, it was pared down to 8 ideas, and in 2009, we managed to clump everything together in a way to try to improve our focus so that we had 3 focuses: children, youth, and families, vital and viable congregations, and urban, ethnic, and multicultural ministries. That's a mouthful.
What's left?
Well, I'll tell you, that wasn't enough. Because what about these other 4 things? The environment, justice work, global partnerships, interfaith ministry. So we kind of made it into this cellular, organic thing that these 3 focuses are floating in the middle of all this. So that was supposed to focus our diocese for the ensuing 3 years, till 2013 or 12 or something. And great. How many of you have done mission strategy work where that's wonderful, everybody gets all excited, and then it gets put in the file cabinet and not much else happens until we say, what about that? Let's pull it out and have a look. I mean, but it's the process itself is so exhausting that you can't carry it out. Sometimes happens. But in this case, because it was small and it was focused, we could take out all the pretty colors and keep the 3 circles and start to plunk down our strategic ministries, our funded congregations, and some of our other strategic ministries in the circles to see whether they were fulfilling our strategic ministry. And you can see that some of them did all 3. This one, for instance, Episcopal City Mission, that we give some money to, is mostly focused on urban, ethnic, and multicultural. The camp and the youth council, more youth and young adults than anything else. But you just kind of get how this works. If you look way up there, you'll see at the very top the word Brockton. Brockton was a funded congregation that had shrunk to such a size that it was not doing ministry anymore, except it had a soup kitchen that was feeding hundreds, but the kitchen was being cited over and over again because it was not up to code. So it was in big trouble. And this exercise of plunking our stuff down on our specific goals helped us to see what were our core ministries and what was something we needed to think about. So in this case, the church in Brockton was huge. It seated 700 people, or it seats 700 people, and it had a worshiping community on a good day of 20 or 30, right? The lower, Steve says. I'm always inflating the numbers. So under 20. Hard to get a vestry pulled together. Hard to make decisions. Their accounting practices were all messed up because there weren't enough people to sign checks, and it was deteriorating rapidly. So we were able to find a community organizing group called Father Bill's Place that caters to homeless ministry who could take over the soup kitchen, and it moved. And we closed the congregation, and the church is for sale. Tough sell. It's a beautiful cram building that should be worth millions, but not in this market and not in this city. But we could not abandon the city of Brockton. This is where the circles, combined with the bishop's insight, help us to make some decisions. Our bishop has been around for 17 years, and he knows the places and he knows the people. Brockton is an old industrial city, a shoemaking city. It's one of our poorest cities. We cannot abandon that city. So in this case, instead of closing the congregation, which we felt it's strategically important to be there, we were able to take the remnant of the congregation, give them a priest, very part-time, very entrepreneurial priest, and they moved in with the Lutheran Church for the short term while we discern, as a bigger group, how the ministry in Brockton, what shape the ministry in Brockton is going to take. So what happens budget-wise, for those of you who care, is they came off of the core budget of the diocese, and it will now be funded by the sales of this building, the sale of this building, until they get back to, it was a mission of the diocese, so the bishop is more responsible for this than for some others of our parishes. So that's one way that we think strategically about how buildings should be used or ministries should be supported. The other thing is on your thumb drive, you'll find this inventory called Vitality and Viability. And this is a inventory that in the beginning was sent out to places where the bishop was going to go on a visitation, and the vestries were to wrestle with it and talk to the bishop about it when he or she got there for their visitation. We've done that enough so that parishes are kind of tired of having to do this for the bishop, but it is a really good tool for parishes, vestries, deaneries to use to think about how are we doing as a parish. It's also a really good tool for us in the diocesan offices to use to say how are they doing as a parish when we're thinking things through. It has different categories. I mean, I don't want to go through the whole thing with you, but it's pretty complete in terms of separating out the idea, is this a vital parish? Are they full of energy? Do they have ministry that's important? And is it a viable parish? Can they sustain themselves? Or if they need help, how much help do they need? So they combine those two pieces into one document with lots of good questions to ponder. So I commend that to you. It's 4 or 5 years old now, 3 or 4 years old, and so there's some things that we missed that we'd like to add to it. And I just want to quickly run through these. We're finding that evangelism, the newcomer committee and the nice newcomer packets, et cetera, is not enough. That we're moving towards the idea that we need to be teaching people to be able to tell their faith stories. And what we use in the Diocese of Massachusetts is something called the public narrative. We train people how to do one-on-ones through a leadership development initiative and various other programs that we have. So one of the questions we would put in here is, how have you moved beyond the newcomer packet in your evangelism? We have no section on how do you use your building and have you had a building audit. So we want to put that in. We have nothing in here on environmental sustainability and of your building, but also what are your practices of environmental sustainability like? Do you print your bulletin? What kind of ink do you use? Not just about building issues. So we want to beef that up. We want to beef up the section on collaboration and partnership and being able to get into your community and understand the needs of the community. Not just we need a soup kitchen, but what are the spiritual needs of the community, but the soup kitchen too. And also we're finding that congregations that are vital and viable have other kinds of partnerships, either interfaith or ecumenical partnerships or partnerships within their deanery or partnerships overseas with some kind of mission. So we want to beef that up a little bit. We're also finding that because our neighborhoods are changing quickly, that cultural competency is really important. It's not just anti-racism training anymore. It's about any kind of immigrant community that's coming in or the changing of suburban communities. How can we be culturally competent, including what our speaker last night was talking about, being culturally competent around the different age groups. We're also finding that connection with the diocese and use of diocesan programs is an indicator of parish health. So we want to put in here a little note that says, have you attended diocesan programs in the last 3 years or something? And then finally, beyond the annual stewardship campaign, which is mentioned in here, a little bit more on planned giving and capital fund drives, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So this is a church, San Juan, Christ Church San Juan, which is extremely vital. They are one of the most multicultural churches we have. We have a Spanish congregation, an African congregation, and a Anglo congregation that kind of work together and kind of don't work together. So there's a little dysfunction in the system there, and they can't support this huge building, and they have questionable business practices and blah, blah, blah. But this is another one that when you put it on the three circles, it is very vital and it's trying. It's just not viable. So this is one where we're saying to them, sell your building and find someplace else in Hyde Park to be a presence. And so we're right in the middle of that conversation with them about how to get out of the building. They're in the argument phase, the bargaining phase. Well, what if we do this? What if we do that? We'll move along. So before I get into statistics, I just want to show you, this is a very cool chart that somebody from Toronto showed me yesterday. I can't remember his name, but it's two axes. Sorry for you math anxiety people, the graph and the Venn diagram. If it's making you crazy, please don't worry. This axis is it mission driven? How's their mission, outreach? And this one is how are their resources, up or down? In this quadrant where you have a good sense of mission, vision, where you're headed, and you have resources, they call that a sustainable congregation. If you have resources and your mission is not so clear, they call it static. And it's clear that with a little bit of help defining a mission, they could move to sustainable. If you have a good sense of mission, but you don't have the resources, they consider that a strategic ministry. And so they would pump some resources into that kind of ministry. And if you don't have a sense of mission and you have no resources, you would be deemed unsustainable. And what they did was they took, I don't know exactly how this worked, but with colored dots, they dotted every parish in there. So this might be red, green, blue, yellow. And then they took the map and they put the colors of the dots on the map to see where these churches clustered. And for instance, they found that a whole bunch of them in the unsustainable group were along one road out of town, getting more and more rural. And so they couldn't get rid of all those churches. They didn't want to get rid of all those churches. It gave them a strategy to think, look, if all of you yellow dots got together, would this work? So it becomes a very visual technique. I can't wait to take that back and play with my stickers.
Vertical axis?
Resources.
Thank you.
Mission, left, right, resources, top, bottom. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about statistics. Imagine our clergy conference. Todd, I don't know whether you were here in 2009 doing this. Clergy conference, 120, 130 clergy, all in the folding chairs in the gym at the camp with the bishop for the day, the bishops for the day. And we had Rob Voyle from Appreciative Inquiry speaking to us about how to change the negative narrative into a positive narrative, how to tell the story of the church in a positive way, how to elicit stories from people. So he's talking along, and all of a sudden he says, well, and how many of you are experiencing growth in your church? And the way he said it, at least the way I heard it, was he was expecting 4 hands out of 120 to go up. Well, it was amazing. 2/3 of the hands went up. 2/3 of the clergy in that room felt their churches were experiencing growth. That is not what our narrative tells us about the declining numbers in the Episcopal Church, right? So our church statistics nerds got to work and said, how can this be true? Those clergy are just lying because they get together and they want to show off and, yeah, we're growing, ha ha ha. Well, the church geek went to work and she discovered that you can go through the parochial report with a fine-tooth comb, and in answer to how many of you are experiencing growth in your church, she took exactly what is on our parochial reports and crunched some numbers and found out of the churches who sent a parochial report and filled it out completely, which is not 100%, 62 reported a growth in membership between 2008 and 2009. Maybe people came back to church because they were losing their money. I don't know. But that is a pretty hard number if you believe that the membership, we're not even going to go there about how those numbers are come to. Number of communicants increased in 55% of the parishes reporting. Communicants under 16 up 54% in 54% of the parishes. But Sunday attendance only went up in close to 40%. So I don't know about you guys, but in Massachusetts, our theory is that people consider themselves members, but only come to church once every 4 to 6 weeks. And that's as much as they can manage in this economy and when you're raising kids playing soccer. Is that about right, Todd? Yeah, I think so. Pledge card numbers increased in close to 50%. The amount pledged increased in close to 44%. But this one, look at pledge and plate went way up. And this correlation here, they think, is in 2008, people were reluctant to pledge because they didn't know what their bank account was going to look like. So they increased their plate giving. This number has gone down. This is kind of reversed again now. I don't have a more current chart. So Lynn Smith, our guru's total number was that actually 95% of our congregations reported growth in some area, in one area. So my urging for you as you go home and you take Kirk Hattaway's numbers, the second part is that when Kirk Hattaway's figures came out about a year ago, maybe not quite so long ago, and said that 100 out of the 110 dioceses in the Episcopal Church, 16 are growing. One of them was the Diocese of Massachusetts. Great. The bishop starts going around and saying, we're growing, we're the only diocese in New England that's growing, we're the only diocese with declining population that's growing. But again, the number crunchers said, wait a minute, we have to check these figures out. And so our people did. They went and talked to Kirk Hattaway to dig deeper into the numbers. What is really happening here? And they can go, if you call New York and talk to Kirk, he can take your diocesan numbers, he can take your parish numbers and help you drill down into what they mean. Now, in the Diocese of Massachusetts, we were on the downward graph just like everybody else. And in the year before the statistics, we had a big dip. And our growth got us back to the line. So it's not, and it's 1 year, so it's not a big deal. But the bishop's question is, something is growing, what is it? And so he's digging deeper and deeper and deeper into, is there a correlation between some of the things in the vital and viable inventory or some of the diocesan programs that people take advantage of? Is there a correlation between that and growth of congregations? So my point here is to urge you to dig into those statistics that we saw yesterday and find out what where your diocese is and what meaning you can get out of it. Because then you can go to the congregations that are experiencing growth in pledge and plate, for instance, and find out, what are you doing, congregation, that is making this happen? And can you share your best practices with churches like you around the diocese? So use the statistics to help us move forward as opposed to thinking, oh my gosh, it's all over. We're on the downward slope and we're not coming back. Freeing up money for ministry. I mean, that's really, if we just had money, we could do a lot of things, right? That's what's holding us up. So what the stewardship process that I'm talking about here is, if you sell buildings, what happens to that money? And our diocesan council developed a policy several years ago that says that the money, for the most part, comes to the diocesan council to decide. So even in those places like Hyde Park and Brockton, where we're putting money back into that community and doing some discernment about worshiping communities there, that money comes to council first, and council will decide how that money is used. Council has voted that half of the money from sales goes into an endowment for congregational vitality. This is an unrestricted endowment that currently we're just drawing the money off to help vital congregations through our operating budget. But it's there in case some big project came along that needed $1 million investment in it to start something new, to try something, the council could take that money, because it's unrestricted, and start up something new. The other half of that money goes through a very complicated, too complicated, so I'm not sharing it with you because we're going to revamp it, process where the local community, the deanery, and other members of the diocese can say, we have this great idea, we'd like some of that money to do it. Or we have this program that's going, we just need 3 or 4 more years of funding to make it self-sustainable. This process has taken so long that the council has actually voted to support some things along the way. One of which, this is an example of the kinds of things that we will hope the money will support, is a very small congregation in a place where the bishops feel it's a good laboratory for developing family ministry. How do you develop from nothing a church school, a youth group? So it's in an area where there are lots of kids and young families around. We put in a full-time entrepreneurial priest. We gave them 3 years of funding, or we will have given them 3 years of funding. And they, on the other hand, had to develop a really good plan with check marks and metrics, et cetera, along the way. So that's how some of this money is being used. Yep.
Is that a plant or a redevelopment?
I don't know what I'd say redevelopment. It's not really a plant because there was a church there.
You had a very small congregation.
Yep. Good lay leadership, good infrastructure.
Mission field was fertile.
Yeah. Yeah. Another use of the money is that there are 2 ways congregations that are closing kind of decide what they want to do next, or at least we've had 2. One of our congregations rented a van and drove around the area and worshiped on Sundays to decide where they would go to church as a group. And with them, we sent some of the proceeds from the sale of the building, and they took an altar and some stained glass windows and made a little chapel in the new church, and the new church vestry, or the existing church vestry, they put people on their vestry, and so they got some money to help make that priest from half-time to full-time and to help build this chapel. So the other way, another church, clergy from the area came in on different Sundays and preached and talked about what life was like in their congregations. And so that church, the people kind of spread out and went to various different churches. So they did not take money with, actually that money is up for grabs still, and people are lobbying for it very strongly. It's kind of be careful what you create. I also want to talk about the capital campaign. What I've learned, the Diocese of Massachusetts, as I said, our bishop has been around for 17 years. He's built great relationships with people, and even people who disagree with him respect him for the most part. And he loves to raise money. He's really, really good at it. And so in the middle of the Great Recession here, all of a sudden we're trying to raise $20 million. That's a lot of money. But the surprise about that, to me, being closer to this campaign than other ones I've been in, is how a capital campaign can help to focus people on what the important ministry of the diocese is. So unlike the 3 little circles up there, the case, it tells the story over and over and over again to people. And this is true in parishes too, is that when you start a capital campaign in a parish, you focus people on what's really important, and you help people learn to tell their stories and explain why this is important. There are 2 aspects of this capital campaign that I think are different and kind of important to talk about in terms of freeing up money for ministry. The consultants that we're working with took an idea that one of our committees had to collaborate with congregations so that the congregations can run a capital campaign in their congregations, staffed by people from the consultant's office and the development office, and they can pick their case, the things that they want to raise money for in the congregations. 70% of the money raised stays in the congregation, and 30% comes to the diocesan capital campaign. So the case is not only what do we need for our parish, there's also talk about what the diocese needs so that there becomes more back and forth talk and buy-in from people. So what's left behind is a congregation with a substantial amount of capital. They say you can raise 3 times your pledge and plate, so you don't need to do a feasibility study. They've done this enough in various different churches to know that that's the formula. And you leave a congregation with a chunk of capital and people who can raise money because they've been trained by the consultants to ask for major gifts, to do solicitations for people. So you've left them with skill. Well, you might say, well, that works in a diocese like Massachusetts. It's kind of got a lot of money. But we're finding that some of our poorest congregations are the best at this and are going far beyond their 3 times pledge and plate. So it doesn't seem to be economic, and our wealthier congregations are a little more reluctant to buy in. The second way that we can leave the congregations with some new skills is what they call an in-pew solicitation, which looks a lot like a fall stewardship campaign. But again, the consultants go in and spend 4 or 5 weeks with the congregation developing the leadership, and you do things like testimonials, and the rector preaches, and the stories are told, etc., and you have an in-gathering, and all of that money goes to the diocese. But the congregation is left trained up to run the next campaign or run their fall campaign in a way that it's quicker than doing it kind of over the years of training. So what I would suggest is go back and start planning a capital campaign. I mean, it is an amazing transformational tool. We have really good advisors that are helping us with this. We don't have the expertise within the diocesan staff. There are lots of good consultants out there. I think it's worth the money to get them. And I'd be glad to share ours with you if you want. But in terms of freeing up money for ministry, the last thing I'll say about our capital campaign is that not much of it is for bricks and mortar. We have $4 million for the cathedral renovations that you saw. Not much of it is for endowment. We're giving, I think, $1.5 million to the camp for their endowment. The rest of it is bundled into going back to congregations in the form of grants for greening their churches, in the form of grants for developing collaborative ministry beyond the diocese. So it's global partnerships. You know, if you come up with a mission trip that you want to take and you can raise half the money, you can apply for a grant as long as you report back and develop the idea that having global partnerships leads to parish development. And then finally, in 6 areas of the diocese, if congregations, 6 or 8 congregations will come together, we will put up to $6 million into that hub, those 6 or 8 congregations. $6 million worth of cash for ministry in their surrounding areas, Life Together or Episcopal Service Corps interns, urban residents, which are clergy that we pay for new clergy we pay for 3 years. Various programs that we have in the diocese that seem to be working will plunk down in these areas of the church, of the diocese for 5 or 6 years and see whether something new can grow out of that and become self-sustainable. So what's selling this is that we're raising the money and giving it back to people in a new form that will transform the church. Lastly, in terms of freeing up money for ministry, this is something I'm just beginning to think about. How many of you have heard of this church as an economic being? Directly in opposition to what Jesus was saying in the temple today, don't make my Father's house a marketplace. Well, that was maybe don't use all the money to keep the temple going. This theory, which is being put forward by Joy Anderson and Criterion Ventures, and her website's on the next slide, says, you know, we're all economic beings. We all have impact by the way we use our money, save our money, or don't save our money. And by not claiming that piece of ourselves, we distance ourselves from what's happening on Wall Street or what's happening in the global economy, and we just throw up our hands and say, I can't do anything. You know, it's way beyond me. Let me just clip my coupons and save my money at the market and I'll be okay. Her theory is that churches in particular have economic power in their communities. So for instance, a simple example is, how many of you have AA meetings or a nursery school in your church buildings? So everybody who comes to an AA meeting, for the most part, comes with a cup of coffee, right? That they've gotten at Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks or somewhere along the way. When the moms drop off their kids at nursery school, they often go to the nearest grocery store. Everybody fills up with gas at the local gas station. If the church disappears, that simple economic traffic disappears and impacts the neighborhoods. So you turn that around is how can you use that economic power for good? It's not economic power for profit. It's not economic power to keep our building going. It's economic power for the good of the neighborhood or the context that you're in, if you're not in a neighborhood. So the other thing that Joy Anderson talks about is that there is venture capital out there for the kinds of things that churches do. There's venture capital out there for people that are trying to improve the world. And she's doing a pilot project that she wants the Diocese of Massachusetts, of Eastern Massachusetts, to participate in. I'm not sure whether we will or not. But she has a bunch of venture capitalists who are interested in pumping money into churches that are willing to green their building as connected with church transformation. It's not just about give us money and we'll put in solar panels. It's about the whole picture of, with this money, can you get your buildings into good shape and use them as a piece of the marketplace? What she's finding is, and that's just one example of the venture capital that's out there for changing the world and doing good things. What she's finding is that there's a wall between the churches who need the money and the venture capitalists. And it's mostly that the churches are reluctant to go after this money. The churches are reluctant to learn the language of venture capital. The churches are reluctant to kind of dirty their hands with this world. And her pilot project will take 50 churches, if they'll choose to come together, and do this greening project. But what she's really focusing on is what keeps our churches from accessing the money that is there. And so I'm really interested in her study. And I don't know whether I'm hitting the wall and I can't get there because I'm not sure we should do it or we can do it. But this is her website. And it's just, as I said, it's something I'm beginning to think about. What does it mean to be an economic being? And what does it mean for our churches to be an economic being? Not to rent our space to the nursery school so we can pay our bills, but so we can develop a nursery school that is Christ-centered and Christ-based and provides after-school care for our neighborhoods or whatever, what is the need there that's going to help to bring people to God and bring in the kingdom. So that's it for me. Now you get Steve.
Before I get into how we try to recast assets, I want to give you a little bit of a context. Geography 101, this is a map of the United States of America. And up in this corner over here is that little state of Massachusetts. The process that we have sort of developed and continues to evolve works for us, but probably is probably challenging in some of these larger states, larger dioceses. So I want to put that out there, that what we're doing is not a panacea for every diocese. Okay? So that's where we are via the whole nation. This is the state of Massachusetts. And though we are called the Diocese of Massachusetts, that's really not right. We are really the Diocese of Eastern Massachusetts. And we are, you probably can't see well, but this line of 495, we're from New Hampshire border all the way to the islands, to the tip of the Cape at Provincetown. That's our diocese. Without too much traffic and stuff. I'm sorry?
You threw the rest of us to the wolves in 1902.
Yes, yeah. Well, that was because bishops were sort of having health problems trying to administer the whole state. So.
We were sick of them, you mean?
No, they kept getting sick. One or two, I think, died from overworked. So if I'm up in the up by the New Hampshire border and I want to drive to Provincetown, maybe 3 hours. So I hope that gives you a feel for what our geography is all about. It's pretty small. Now, the next one. This is our diocese itself. It's this sort of line here. And within this section, we still have now 173 congregations. And most of these congregations are clustered in such areas that where you live, you could drive within 15 or 20 minutes, and there would be 4, 5, 6, or 7 Episcopal churches that you could choose to worship in. Okay? Primarily, we are a urban, suburban diocese. That's what we're all about. And so what we have evolved into in terms of our process fits our scheme. The Diocese of Vermont, as you can imagine, is pretty rural. And so when they go to take a look at dealing with a church that maybe needs to close, they have to be creative in some different ways. And in the Diocese of Vermont, for example, they work with Partners for Sacred Spaces, because what they try to do is they try to repurpose church buildings so that the congregation can continue to be in that site, but the building has evolves to deepen its roots in the community, so it's also a site for the community. So that helps it financially to be taken care of and to allow everybody to sort of say, oh, okay, this is then a community center as well as a church. Okay, now, let's go to the next one. Mally already mentioned, and I want to repeat, all of these documents are on your flash drive. Okay? Mally's already mentioned the vitality and viability, which is sort of this inventory that we use to really determine, what's going on. One of my responsibilities working in congregational support is that I work with a team of volunteers, one of whom is here, Jeff Brown. And there's over a dozen of these congregational business consultants, and then almost another dozen of these congregational coaches who are all primarily volunteers, who work with me and Mally and the bishops and stuff to provide assistance for congregations. And a few years ago, did you have a question, sir? No, okay. And a few years ago, when we were also working on the vitality and viability, Jeff and a couple of others came to us and said, we have a lot of churches that are only open on Sunday. And yeah, we have some that have preschools and 12-step programs, but maybe we could advance this notion about a church can be a community center. And so they created this wonderful document called A Guide to Utilization of Church Property, and we have distributed it all over the diocese. And whenever we can, and there's a meeting, we distribute it again, because we try to encourage congregations to figure out, are there some missed opportunities here in terms of how they could be more deeply rooted within their community. That gets them more well-known, that in some ways hopefully proclaims the gospel of Jesus Christ, because remember, that's what it should be all about. Now, there is a warning in that, though. Every once in a while, we get a phone call from a church who does do this. They are engaged in the community, and actually, maybe they have some 12-step programs, but they have a after-school program or a preschool program which contributes 40 or 50% of their total revenue, and they have left the church. And so the church not only has lost this tenant, but because they are so dependent upon that revenue, they're in deep doo-doo. Okay? So there is a curse and a blessing in understanding how it is that your church building can be a community center. My own personal opinion is this. We're not the Elks or the Kiwanis or any other type of community or social service organization. We ought to be primarily in the business of proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ into the community that we live in. That's what we need to be all about. But we can also expand that to how is it that we can understand proclaiming the gospel. And if we can provide opportunities to deepen our relationship in that community, then we ought to do it. Okay? So there's this balance. So this is a very helpful document that we've been using for a while. The next thing, we a few years ago created this document which has been approved by Diocesan Council. It's called the Diocesan Guidelines for Assessing Whether a Congregation is at Risk. I came into this position about 5 or 6 years ago. And at that time, we had a number of congregations that were in free fall. And so we had to come up quickly with some way to try to deal with those that were in free fall. By free fall, what I mean is they were down to very few numbers on a Sunday. They maybe had very little cash in the bank account. They had deferred maintenance up the yin-yang. they were literally living on life support. And we drew to the conclusion that, okay, we need to do something about that. But we also were aware that we needed to do something about those congregations that were not at that point, but that might be heading for that cliff. And so vitality and viability, the utilization guide, you know, those were attempts to give us resources to try to sort of, okay, offer something else. Where this particular document came in is, I call it the extra canonical document. You know, sometimes if you were here Sunday night, you heard Sean raise the issue that the Episcopal Church is struggling to be what it needs to be, and he was specifically at one point talking about the budget process, talking about General Convention, and how is it that this structure mirrors who we are. And I've talked with a lot of people in other dioceses, and you know, our canons don't quite capture what's happening sometimes. And sometimes in a congregation, things are happening fast and furious, and you don't have time to figure out which canon is applicable before you send somebody in. So we came up with this diocesan guidelines for assessing whether a congregation is at risk, which basically says that if the bishop feels that through conflict or troubling circumstances this congregation is at risk, the bishop can step in and can send a team in and to really engage that congregation in a conversation and a dialogue which might go on months to try to figure out what's really going on. Is there a way to stem whatever is going on, ending the conflict, heal the wounds or whatever, so that eventually the congregation can then get its act together and it can revitalize itself. And that is the first and foremost hope of what we want to try to do. Or if it can't, and in one of the circumstances where we use this, we could not solve the conflict. We just could not build the bridges necessary to bring two competing camps together. This then gives us an entrance to begin the process of saying the congregation needs to close. So this is just another sort of resource that we have.
And don't compare it to your canons.
Right, yes, it is extra canonical. One of these days our canons will get caught up. And then to actually go through the closing or restructuring, we put together this manual for a parish congregation. Now, with one exception, which is St. Albans Lynn, it is our bishop's position that we do not go in and say to somebody, you're going to close. What we do is we enter into conversations. Sometimes they're very lengthy conversations. We use consultants, we use coaches. Occasionally we use the congregation at risk policy that I just showed you. But it's all about having conversations. And for the most part, what we have found is that if we have these conversations and if we can get beyond the fear and sometimes the obstinacy and the pain of it all, that after a while, a couple people on the vestry will usually take me aside and they will say to me, Steve, I'm really exhausted. I've been the warden and the junior warden back and forth now for the past 10 years. These are my brothers and sisters. You know, I just can't give up on them. To do so, I would just feel so guilty. And we have been able on a number of occasions to get their confidence and to help them to realize that, it's okay to pull the plug. And we're going to be there with you. And so that's why we really emphasize conversations. I always go in with another person, and we try to make it happen. Are there any questions so far? Okay, let me go talk a little bit about St. Albans Lynn. It's in the east section of Lynn. It's a mission. They have never, ever, ever asked the diocese for a dime. They pay their bills. They take care of themselves. They were running about 20 or 30 in terms of an average Sunday attendance. Most of the members no longer lived in Lynn or in East Lynn. And East Lynn was becoming a very, very changed, it had become a very changed community. So the social service agency that runs a lot of Head Start programs and other things in the city of Lynn heard about this building and approached the bishop and said, you know, we have a preschool problem in this part of Lynn. We have a list of children, I think there were about 50 or 60 children, that there was no place for them to go for Head Start. And they said, you know, this building would really be perfect. And our bishop really has a strong passion for youth and children ministry. And he prayed and pondered over that. And he said, well, it is a mission. And so he decided that he was going to call them in, and he was going to work in the process of making the decision that this church was going to close, and that we were then going to negotiate with this local nonprofit organization. Well, he brought them in, and all hell broke loose, as you can imagine. The one ministry that they really had in terms of outreach at St. Albans was they were the center in East Lynn for 12-step programs. And so when the bishop went to a meeting to explain to the membership what he was going to do, there were members galore representing the 12-step programs, which were right in that meeting, and they were just swinging that bat. They were not happy. And there was press, and there were letters to the editors, and it got really, really, it was a very difficult time. Mally was at a couple of those meetings. And I and an attorney, one of our business consultants, was given the task of meeting almost every week with the vestry. And after a couple of months, you know, we just weren't getting anywhere. Everybody was digging in. There were letters to the editors which were likening the diocese as being like Nazis. It was pretty crude. And in one of those meetings one night, late at night, the Spirit came upon us. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that all of the stuff that we have, these are just guides. Use them as guides. They're not etched in stone. But always allow time for the work of the Spirit. And that night, somehow the Spirit came upon myself and the consultant, and we both found ourselves looking at each other and saying, you know, we need to start over. You know, the conflict is just so deep, we just need to start over. So we said, we're going to. So what we said to the vestry is, you know, what if we could craft a covenant which would say, on behalf of the diocese, to you, the vestry, that we're sorry, that we apologize that this has happened to you, and we know it wasn't the right thing to do the way this all worked out, and ask your forgiveness. And we would ask of you, if possible, to forgive us. We're not going to haul you into court. We're not going to sue you. Can we find a way to forgive each other? We may not like it. We may not like what's going to happen. But you know, you're a mission. The title to the property is owned by the diocese, and we just need to get on. But is there a way that we can get on and try to love and care with each other as best as we can? And we'll try to work with you on things that are important for you beyond the building. And the attorney consultant actually wrote this wonderful 2-page document. And I thought, oh boy, what's the chancellor of the diocese going to say about this? And the chancellor said it was okay. And then we took it to Mally, and Mally said, this looks okay. And then she took it to the bishop. And you know what? The bishop said it's fine, and the bishop signed it. And then we shared it with the vestry. And the vestry had some long conversations. And then every member of the vestry signed it. And we started all over again. It wasn't going to change the fact that the building was still going to be closed and probably sold to this social service organization. But we were able to sort of, from a faith perspective, say, you know, we recognize that there were some things done here that should not have been done. And we pledge to ourselves internally that we will never, ever, ever do a closing like that again. And we were able to work through it. And there are now 60 children in this Head Start program at that site as we speak. And some of those folks, a lot of them who are elderly, have gone on to some other Episcopal churches. Some have returned to some Roman churches. And some are, I suspect, still gathering as a community, and I don't ask too many questions about that. So that's sort of the story of St. Albans. But except for that, we've been able to try to sort of, through conversation and what I like to call moral suasion, allowing for the presence of the Spirit to make things happen. Let's go to the chart a minute so they can understand the process. And let's go right to the one with the discernment one. This is sort of our approach. We always ask a mission to become, the parish to become a closing mission. In Massachusetts, most of our congregations are incorporated. So in addition to dealing with canon law, we also have to deal with civil law. And that can take time. It can take time to sell a piece of church property and to go through all of the steps that are necessary to do that. And then it can take time to go to the Attorney General's office to get permission to dissolve the corporation, which we have to do in Massachusetts. So what we've learned is that in the closing mission bylaws, once those are in effect, the current governing body of the vestry, they all resign. We turn the files and all the finances over to the diocesan office, and it all goes through my particular office. And we pay the bills and we keep things functioning. And the bishop appoints usually me, the clerk, to handle some of the legal stuff. And then it leaves you two other people who are going to hang in there for whatever the time is necessary to go all the way through the closing process. We do not, so far, we have never had any member of the congregation join us on the governing body. They're in grief, they're struggling, you know, they're not going to want to stick around for 2, 3, 4, 5, in one case, 6 years to go through the whole process. However, though, what we have found is we can have them join us on the closing committee, and that is populated by them. And they advise the governing body on all kinds of things about memorials. Oh, you know, that altar cross was given by Miss Mabel, and I know somebody who would love to have that. Or do you think that altar cross could go to Episcopal Church or maybe even a Lutheran church or some other church over here? So they help us figure out where do things need to go. And they also advise us. Now, while they're doing that, we work hard on pastoral care. If possible, and the priest has the ability and the calling to do it, we will pay the priest to continue to provide pastoral care. We work closely with the dean because we have a deanery, and the dean gets involved in the process, and then I try to sort of pitch in, and we'll go to coffee with people and stuff like that. We try to encourage, we try to facilitate people to find new faith homes. Sometimes we're more successful than other times, but that's sort of how we do it. And we also have this discernment committee, and I'm just realizing, Mally, that it's a pastoral care, it's a governing body, but we should add a line from the closing committee also, all right? And this would be comprised of members of the church and members of the deanery and maybe some diocesan folks to help figure out what's next. What we have learned is that in order for there to be a resurrection, there has to be a death. I want to repeat that. In order for there to be a resurrection, there has to be a death. The buildings should be only a means of ministry. And often when we are talking with people, we try to draw a distinction, and it's a tough distinction for them to hear, that often we're about the business of closing a building. But what then becomes of the ministry? In some cases, it may be an ending of the ministry, or it may be a merging of the ministry, or it may be a recreation of the ministry. Can you sort of hear that distinction? When you're in pain and you're losing your home, it's very, very hard for people to hear that, which is why when we do these conversations, they can go on for months, folks. And we intentionally have decided to take that time in hope that where we are imperfect in doing something, that somehow the Spirit might redeem that and make it more perfect. So that's sort of how we do it. And then off on the side is the stewardship, way over here on the right. And Mally has sort of mentioned that that's been a struggle sometimes. We have recasted assets of about probably over $5 million, I think, in total so far. We've gone through 12 church closings and mergers. On my whiteboard are 8 more. Tomorrow night, I go to a church where the vestry has promised me that they're going to vote on whether or not they want to close. They have $9,000 in their operating fund. They have $7,000 in their building fund. They rent out their rectory. The tenants of the family in the rectory has stopped paying the rent, has gone to the town, and the town has cited the church for all kinds of code violations in that building. And at the last vestry meeting, they voted to spend $10,000 to meet those code requirements. They owe on a diocesan Stokes loan. I'm forgetting what amount, but it's tens of thousands of dollars, and they're behind several years on their assessments. Maybe they get 20 people on a good Sunday. I think Easter they got maybe 40 or 50. Those who've been in a leadership position have been in the leadership position forever. The warden really wants out, and the treasurer wants out, and there's really nobody else. But they can't quite make a decision what to do. So I'm going to go there tomorrow night. I'm going to bring a consultant with me, and we're going to continue to sort of just have these conversations. But that's sort of what it's about. Now, let's look at some pictures. Here, St. George's Maynard, a church building, a house behind it, and a parking lot. It took us 6 years to get this all figured out, to bring it to a closing. We ended up, well, first of all, we had to rezone the whole property because it was all one parcel. And we had to go hire a local attorney who knew the people in it's the city of, I think it's either city or town, who knew all the right people, because it got very, very political. But we were eventually able to reparcel the property, and we were able to sell off the parking lot to a family that was going to build an energy-efficient house. We were able to sell the house, but first we had to get rid of ants, and then we had to do significant rewiring, and then there was a problem with some roofing or something or other, which all got in the way of the sale, and we had to figure that out. And then we eventually sold the church building, but not as a church. It's going to become a two-family dwelling. St. Andrew's Lawrence is now...
You had a decommissioning there.
Oh, yes, right, yeah. Yeah, let me also clarify that in each of these situations, there is a closing service, and we work with the members of the congregation to have an appropriate closing service. Sometimes it's open to the public, and sometimes it's closed. It's their desire. But in addition, before we sell any of our property, unless it was going to a Lutheran church or something, we always deconsecrate it, and we bring a bishop in, and we secularize it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And it's important, in Massachusetts, the towns are beginning to want to have real estate tax paid on buildings not used for sacred purposes. So the closing ceremony for the congregation and the deconsecration are very far apart sometimes. The deconsecration happens once the property is sold, in hopes that we can still consider it a sacred use building, to not have to pay real estate tax.
Yeah. So we often will put meetings of the closing committee and the governing body at the church, and we always have prayer. And we say that to the city and town if they start questioning us. We had one church closing and sale in Halifax where when we went to closing, we discovered the city had begun to assess us property taxes. It was a couple of $100. We took the position that we were going to pay it. We just didn't bother to sort of fight it. St. Andrew's Lawrence is now owned by the Seventh-day Adventist. First and foremost, it is always our wish and desire to keep a property as a church. And we have been somewhat successful in finding church groups who have the resources to be able to acquire it. Storefront churches, some of our more evangelical brothers and sisters step up to the plate. Okay, this is not a church, but this is a little different way of looking at buildings. Way back here is a house. And that was the rectory. And this was a dying Anglo congregation. And the Chinese missioner from the cathedral had begun to do some ministry in this area because it has a growing Chinese community. And had put together an after-school program and then did a summer program, and it's just been growing and growing and growing. And so some people thought that perhaps the future of this church is going to be as a congregation ministering to the Chinese community. But they were running out of money. And the Anglo leadership, some of whom were very, very sophisticated, so I don't suggest this for everybody, but they were extremely sophisticated, and they got the idea, what if we tear that rectory down and we build a condominium section? See all those, 5 or 6 condominium units, one of which becomes the house for the rector. And it generates a stream of income, which they put in an endowment, and they'll be able to draw on that endowment for the next 4 or 5 years to sort of see what's going to happen with the Chinese community and with themselves, so that if the Anglo church was going to die out, it's going to buy some time to build up the Chinese community. And it was a very interesting approach, and for the most part it was successful. They did all this before the crash. Unfortunately, when they went to invest their money, they went into high-risk instruments, and then they panicked before they came and talk to us, and then they cashed it out. They've hung in. They're still here. It was a great idea, but it kind of got derailed. And in hindsight, probably what we should have done through the standing committee is there should have been some strings attached as to how they would invest it in a more balanced portfolio approach. Can we go back to St. Matthew and the Redeemer, the back one here? South Boston, right across the street from a massive Roman Catholic church. They had maybe 12 people, sometimes 5 or 6. What this particular church did is, when they finally reached the conclusion to close, they said to the diocese that they wanted the proceeds to go to St. Mary's in Dorchester. And what the diocese tries to do in those particular situations, if the diocese and the bishops thinks that it's worthwhile, then that's probably what we'll do, and that's exactly what happened.
And that was the roof on the decaying building
Right.
that I talked about.
So it was an A-frame 1960s built church, not an older church, nothing historical other than it meant a lot for a handful of people. The Roman Catholic Archdiocese has closed a lot of churches, and there are a lot of those buildings lying around all around the Boston area. Most of those properties are valued above $500,000 into $1 million or more. And so they've had great difficulty selling them. Most of our closings so far have been valued at a $200,000 or a $300,000 or a $400,000. And we do a commercial appraisal and a building inspection in every case. So we have a good handle on what's happening to the property. This one was almost $1 million in valuation. So we approached some church groups, but there just were not any out there that could afford a building at that level. We also approached a number of nonprofit groups because that's sort of the second tier. If we can't continue as a church, can it be a site for a nonprofit organization? And we came up empty there. So we finally bit the bullet, and we decided that we would talk with some developers, and we found a local South Boston developer who was well known in the community, understood the politics, and they made a pretty attractive offer that came within the parameters that we were offering it for sale. And the result is they tore it down and they built a condominium unit. Of the 12 that we've gone through so far, one got torn down to become a parking lot in Fall River. It was a merger of 3 churches. It's a parking lot for a Roman Catholic credit union and hospital. And the, what do you call it, the footstone? Yeah, thank you. The cornerstone remains in a wall on the parking lot to commemorate that it was a church. And then this one here. So far, we've been able to, in the selling of the property, at least retain the outside structure. It may not be used as a church, but we've been able to maintain the outside structure. This is a good one. This is Holy Trinity Marlborough. They had been meeting with one of our bishops. They were very conservative. They were very much, they were very high church, and they were very drawn to to the other Anglican churches. So one day they had a meeting, and they called in Bishop Budd, and they said, we're going to go to one of the other Anglican churches. And they got up, and everybody, they just got up and left. And they left us a fully stocked church. But now, as you take a look at that, it's like, that's a church, Pierce? Well, it was a house, and then it was a beauty salon before it became a church. All right? So it took us months to figure out what to do with things, and we found some people who had been members there and who had left some time ago and who were still active in the Episcopal Church. They had left over some of the conservative issues and stuff because they didn't agree with the conservative issues, and they had stayed Episcopalian. So they helped us figure this all out. We shopped it around, could not find a nonprofit group interested, could not find any church groups in that area interested, but was approached by a family that said, could they buy it as a house, to become a house? And we said, sure. So Marlborough became a house. The other one that became a house, and I don't think we have a picture of it, is St. David's in Halifax. It also became a house. Let's go back to St. Luke's Malden. Mally mentioned about the church that rented the van. This is it. Now, I happen to live in Malden, and I worship at St. Paul's. We have a lot of areas where there was a mill owners church and there was a mill workers church. And unfortunately, buried in the DNA was this issue about St. Luke's doesn't talk to St. Paul's and St. Paul doesn't talk to St. Luke's. So ergo, they went off to St. John's Saugus. So that's just to give you a feel. It's about 11:30 now. The documents are on your flash drive. In addition, there is a resource, if you're into reading to sort of seeing what's out there, because there are some very good resources, and on that flash drive there is resources. And before you leave, see me, I have my business cards, and I have a few hard copies of some of the documents that I've talked about. I don't want it for everybody, but I have a few, and I'd rather not bring them back to the diocesan offices. So see me. Mally, you've got one final comment?
Just to remind us back again, we've talked a lot about buildings, but repairing the church is really about the people. So thank you all for your attention and for being here.